Slab building is using flat sheets of clay to build with. The key to working with slabs is having all of the pieces you are trying to attach together in the same state of firmness. If you don't do this, you are going to run into many problems, and your piece is likely to crack, if not outright break apart on you. Slabs can be rolled out by hand with a rolling pin or with a slab roller. Sunshine Cobb aims to instill a sense of age as is apparent in discarded objects. She induces feelings of nostalgia and wanderlust in her ceramic objects. By exploring and creating vessels kept within arm's reach, she hopes to communicate how an object's significance can grow and change depending on the path of a person's life, and how the relationship between function and ornament shifts throughout the course of a day, a week, or a year. Through form and surface, her goal is to communicate a sense of home and memory, but also to evoke that feeling of wanderlust that has informed her own life and visual sensibilities. Cobb looks at objects around her, particularly objects that have had time to age, and pulls inspiration in terms of form or surface from them. She frequently goes to thrift and vintage shops, estate and garage sales, to find worn objects for inspiration for both forms and textures. Old toolboxes, cheese graters, any number of things, soda bottle carriers, old boxes, all are sources of inspiration for her. These are a few of her handled trays. Cobb relies on texture and color to create a sense of motion and time in her work. Her glazes tend to be very muted tones, as though the color has faded with time. They are usually also quite matte. They're not generally shiny, just because that shows the wear much better than a shiny object will. And what object does the shape on the left remind you of? Can you think of something that you interact with, at least on a weekly basis or something like that, that reminds you of? What about the piece on the right? Does it remind you of anything? Richard Notkin explores the complex environmental, political, and economic impacts of contemporary human civilization upon the ecological and spiritual condition of our planet, and the quality of life of individual human beings. He presents these concerns, about which he is very passionate, by visually manipulating and juxtaposing various objects, images, and symbols to create narrative sculptural works which stimulate the viewer to examine their own innermost feelings and relations to the world. Ultimately, his current works are about lessons heard but not heeded during the 20th century, and how these ignored lessons will affect this new century and the human species' ability or inability to survive the next 100 years. His work is a visual plea for sanity. These works are beautifully textured, but typically very simple in shape. Their degree of functionality varies, with some works only retaining the general shape of functional wares, but utterly impractical to actually use. Can you imagine actually using this as a teapot? I certainly can't. That spout will not pour well. That is going to pour all over the table. Catherine Morling creates sculptures in porcelain in her signature monochromatic aesthetic. Each piece on the surface is an inanimate object, is inspired by Catherine's personal narrative. The work is made and fired without glaze to accentuate the drawn quality of the work. So that drawn black line is actually done either with slip or a wash to emphasize all of the edges and make these seem more like a drawing. One piece leads to the next, and she works very instinctually. Her work represents her inner searching, shown outwardly in domestic and uncanny scenes. And the sheer complexity and number of parts to these pieces, I can only imagine how long they actually take to construct. especially as porcelain is not a very forgiving material. Mark Ferris works with simple, familiar forms, breaking the forms down into their basic geometries to define the vessel. These have their basis in vernacular, rural architecture, and no-frills utilitarian buildings. His color palette is very simple, reflecting his rural environment and nodding at color field painting from the 60s and 70s. Notice how simple these forms are, and yet they are utterly unmistakable as to them being very functional. He is very much emphasizing the function in these sorts of pieces, and some of his other pieces become more sculptural. These pieces aren't precision geometries. He only uses technology, 3D or CAD modeling, to plan out these pieces occasionally. All of his templates are handmade from tar paper and adjusted via testing. So, for example, the image on the left is actually the template for this cup on the right. And it's created via these rectangular areas that have these cutouts towards the bottom to separate them apart. Yet when you fold all of these pieces together and form a circle, it actually all folds together to create a cylinder. And this takes a lot of manipulation to get it to fit exactly perfectly. And these templates are actually reusable multiple times, so if he needs to make a full set of pieces, he can reuse them. Ferris's larger works often bridge the gap between functional objects and sculpture. This three-piece set of vases are designed for the surface decoration and color to match up and react with the pieces next to them. These are technically functional objects, and as they are vases, an odd shape does work for that. They are a little bit difficult to use, and can you imagine actually pouring water out of that after it's been used? Jonathan Hopp's work reflects the idea of merging new technologies into a traditional hand construction practice. Digital design and prototyping tools and industrial production methods and manual work are all part of the process. Can you see a relation to, say, architectural design and drawing in these? Because they have a very architectural feel, they're very geometric, and these also are pieces that sort of bridge the divide between functional and sculptural works. The larger pieces definitely lean more towards sculpture, and some pieces are very strictly sculptural. The smaller pieces do sort of feel like cups, however the reality of actually using them at cups would definitely be a bit challenging, and the sharp corners on those would make them very difficult to clean. This is an example of how Hopp designs his smaller pieces with paper templates. He actually draws on top of the template while it is still on the piece to have the drawing pressed into the surface through slip or underglaze. Brenda Quinn's work is inspired by and is a nod to the broad history of decorative arts. Developing forms that have a utilitarian function and a dynamic design is like trying to solve an evolving equation with an elusive answer. For her, this equation becomes more complicated with the addition of an ever-expanding range of functions, techniques, and glazes to her working vocabulary. So she looks a lot at historical ceramics and pulling inspiration from those. The piece on the right is very much a functional piece, but how does it relate to the piece on the left? Are both still strictly functional, or is she starting to also work between function and sculpture? Functional work can be very sculptural, depending on the artist. Notice how she uses surface decoration, layers of color and pattern. Some of this is done with slip or washes or underglaze, but the color is typically done with glaze itself. Roberta Masuch constructs these pieces with minimalist architectural ceramic forms, which are coated with a film of directed or reflected light from adjacent brightly colored surfaces. Based in color theory, these three-dimensional still lifes address the perception of objects and the spaces between. Stiff slabs of clay are great for piercing with cutout areas, such as these almost brick-like pieces that have a lot of cutouts in them. Look through the artists at artaxis.org and the Pinterest list. Link will be available on our project page.